Hello, guys. So I have a problem that I've experienced while trying to write a simple app with the Next.13 folder. I'd like to show you how I came about solving it. So in Next.13, there's basically two ways to fetch data. So there's client-side data fetching and there's server-side data fetching. So with the server-side data fetching, you directly fetch the data using, I think you can directly use the fetch API. When you're fetching on the client side, you have to use another library that has the same amount of features that server-side data fetching has. So for me, I use a SWR library. And SWR only works on the client side. You can't fetch data with it on the server. So that's why at the top of your file, you have to explicitly add the use client directive for it to actually work. And one of the problems that I have with this hook and with the limitation of having to use it on the client is you can't do server-side rendering. So you can't prefetch data for your pages with SWR. So let me show you what I mean by this. So this is the page I'm building. And if you refresh the page, you can see that the data gets loaded. While the data is loading, there's the loading UI first, and then after the data is fetched, you show the screen. And you can see the request that fetches the data here, right? So what I want this page to do, I want it to display the data instantly. I don't want to have to wait for the data to be fetched first every time I refresh the page to display it. I need some sort of caching mechanism. And SWR has this built in. So if you go to, say, another page, the data is fetched and then displayed. And then if you go back to the first page, you can see that it's instant. And for the page you've visited, the data is displayed instantly. I want the same behavior. Like I want the data to be displayed instantly when fetching the home page. I'm going to show you how you can set up something that does this with SWR. So we need two components to get this to work. So the first component you're going to need is SWR consumer and SWR provider. So I'm using two files for a specific reason. Remember I mentioned that you cannot do data fetching using SWR on the server. So we need a way to figure out how we can fetch the data on the server without using used SWR. And then on the client, populate the SWR cache with that data on the client only component. So there won't be any errors because SWR will be used only on the client, but the data will be fetched on the server. So I think we can start with the SWR consumer. So a client component, you need to explicitly add the use client directive at the top of the file. So we can export a default. So our SWR consumer component needs two props. So there's the children prop. It will be sort of a wrapper component where you put it at the top of your component tree, and then all children will just get passed through it. So we need the children and the initial data. These are the two props that we need this component to accept. And then what we're going to return is SWR config. So SWR config is another export from SWR library that can be used to set the configuration options for SWR. So one of the props it accepts is value, where we can set, there's a fallback prop where you can set it to the initial data. So it will use this data that we provide to it as a data source instead of fetching it directly over the API. And don't forget to pass the children down the component tree. So let's go to the SWR provider component. So this is going to be our server component. So let's export it, SWR provider. So this will also be like a wrapper component. So it will receive the children and pass it down. So SWR provider will return the SWR consumer, and pass down the children. There's one more prop that we need to provide, which is the initial data. So data, and then we can have a get initial data function. So because you're doing an await here, this should be an async component. And then, so the initial data would be the data. Good. So we have passed the two props that it requires, the initial data and the data. What you have left with is implementing the get initial data function. So async function get initial data. So one important thing that you need to consider is the shape of the data that you're going to pass into SWR config. So the data will be an object with a key and a value. So this is what will be returning. So if you look at the data fetching function, or the call to the use SWR hook, it accepts two props, the key and the function that will do the data fetching. So the key is very important because SWR will use the key as a lookup to check its cache and see if the data you're trying to get is there. So if you provide it a new key, it will fetch the data afresh from your data fetching function and return it. But if you had already fetched the data, then it will just get it from its cache and display it. So that's why in our preview here, if you go to a page that you had not visited before, so the data will be fetched and displayed. And if you go back to a page that you had visited before, the data will be displayed instantly. So we need to make the key match whatever key we are setting in the fetch function here. So you can just look into the URL. So for the first page, so it's just search with an empty query string and a page one key. So that is what we need for the initial request when the page is loaded. So the key is API search with an empty query string in the first page. So the value will be the JSON that we're going to fetch. So this the value depends on how you fetch your data. So you can be getting it directly from the database or from an API service. So for me, I get it from an API service. So I have an API based URL where we get the data from. So we have a base URL. So the response, we just await, we call fetch. So base URL, and then so we are calling API search with an empty query string and page one. So the JSON will be just be response the JSON. Oh, and the last thing we need to do is include this implementation in the uppermost component in our component tree. So that could be the root layout. So in the root layout, we can add the SWR provider and pass in the children. So this will be used in all the components down the tree. So let's go and test out and see how it works. So if you refresh the page, it looks like the request is still being sent for the same data that you have already provided in the cache. And SWR is very aggressive in its caching policies. So every time it assumes that your data is stale. So you need to explicitly tell it that please pick this data from the cache instead of sending another request. And you can do that from the configuration options. So in the SWR consumer, there's revalidate on mount that enable or disables automatic revalidation when component is mounted. So when the component is initially mounted, SWR will assume that the data you provided to it in the cache is already stale. So if you turn the option off, revalidate on mount, it won't fetch the data if the, let's try to remount. Yeah, you can see that the request to the API has not been sent at all. So it has picked it from the cache that we provided to it earlier. So there's also a revalidate on focus option that's also very interesting. So if you switch tabs, for example, and then go back to the tab, the data is refreshed. Switch to another tab and go back, the data will be refreshed. SWR will assume that it's a signal for it to refresh the data and will assume that the data it has is stale. So if you don't want that to happen, you can also turn the option off. So revalidate on focus, false. So if you turn that off, so let's refresh the page and go away from the page and come back. You can see that a request is not sent. So I hope that was helpful and helped you figure out this problem if you had it. So thanks for watching and see you next time.